If there's one thing that ties together the lives of every shy gifted kid middle schooler, it would be the book series Keeper of the Lost Cities. Like many others, I discovered Keeper in 5th grade. I had an admittedly pretty bad school and social life when I was most fixated on it, but the comforts of the Lost Cities were enough to keep me sane. But as I got older and reread the books, I found myself enjoying them much less than I had initially. This was even when I was still hyperfixating on the series, less than a year after my initial read. This obviously wasn't a case of personal bias. I currently don't have any real emotional attachment left for the actual series, and upon rereading it, I was very surprised at the general trash pile that is the Keeper of the Lost Cities series. This video, as you can already tell, is going to be pretty long. Since this is my first analysis video, and to keep it from being too long, I'm going to skip over a lot of major plot points in the series. There will be trigger warnings for each section, so make sure you read them. I'm also going to refrain from cursing so that this video is able to reach a bigger audience. And, of course, there are going to be spoilers for the entire Keeper series from books 1 to 8.5. I'm not trying to discourage you from reading the Keeper series. I'm about to throw a bunch of shade onto it, but I still enjoyed rereading the series for this project, and I'd recommend you do the same. I worked this hard on the video because I want the Keeper series to improve and learn from its mistakes. But this is still a critique of the books, so here it is. From a fan's perspective, I'm answering these questions. What exactly made Keeper a bad series? When did it start? And can the series be fixed? First Keeper book is an interesting case. It's not unique in its setup, but what it steals from Harry Potter, it makes up for in the complex, dysfunctional society that Sophie gets to know better as the series progresses. Rereading the first book, I could immediately see what got me hooked on the series. It starts with a vivid description of sensory overload, and then immediately launches into action. You pick up not only the scenery and moods of San Diego and the Elven cities, but also the difference in moods between these two settings. And that's where the first installment excels, in its world building. The first act of the book shoves so much information and lore and mystery onto you, but it was never so much that you couldn't keep track of it. None of the world building felt out of place in the book, even with the exposition stuff with the 10 million abilities that elves have. Gotta have a magic system, I guess. And even then, there's enough lore behind how the abilities work that's spread across all the books that it doesn't matter. So within the first 100 pages of the book, we already have an air of mystery and a well-established world with character motivations. What are we going to do with that? Nothing! There is no plot in the second act. It does build up the world a little more, but most of it is spent at Sophie's magic school, Foxfire, switching between weird things are happening to Sophie, and now Sophie's in the medical wing again. Sophie has a lot going on outside of school at this point, like her growing relationship with her foster parents, who are still reeling from the death of their daughter. I wish we could have seen more of that, especially since most of the drama in the third act is caused by that. There are also many new characters introduced in the second act. Most of them are just there to serve as exposition about the world and how Sophie is treated at school. One of them, Marilla, was my favorite character when I first read the series, but I was kind of disappointed to see that she didn't do much or even have much of a personality. I liked her snarky attitude when I was in 5th grade, and I wanted to see more of her, but she's really only there to give Sophie information about the mysteries that have already been set up. Other useless school characters are Scheele, the generic bully, and Jency, the slightly annoying kid who does nothing. Marilla does get more development and a backstory in the later books. I love her character considering how she's portrayed across the whole series, but she's still basically Keith, only now with a slightly different version of Dex's backstory. Don't get me wrong, I still think there's a lot to unpack with her trauma and motivations, but it doesn't add much to the plot. Maybe it would've if different story choices had been made later in the series. Most of the main characters of the series are introduced in book 1 as well. Deanna's there, and her emotions don't really make sense, but she's still there. Keith's there as well, and he doesn't show up that often. He's really one-sided until a particular moment in the book that made me genuinely interested to know more about his character. He's portrayed as this delinquent kid that makes constant, horrible jokes, but when he's around his dad in one scene, he's quiet and almost seems ashamed of himself for just existing. He doesn't have a lot of plot relevance, which is surprising considering he's everything but the main character by book 8. But we'll get to that when we need to. If you're a Keith stan, close this video before I make you mad. Fitz isn't seen as much as you'd expect based on his involvement in the first act. He doesn't get a lot of development, but you can bet he'll need to get an ego check in the future. Dex's character is interesting and has more than one dimension, which I appreciate. He wants to prove himself and tries to live up to unrealistic expectations because he wants his family and himself to be treated with respect. He also doesn't like being left out of things, so he's rightfully angry when he finds out that Sophie's keeping secrets from him. The book makes you really empathize with the guy. It's pretty clear why he's so well loved by the fandom. After the Foxfire shenanigans are over, the plot continues with Sophie trying to save her human family from a firestorm that's been set by an elf. Then she falls out with Dex as friends, finds out that Grady and Edelin have canceled their request for adoption, and is suddenly kidnapped along with Dex. This is so much whiplash that it looks like it came out of nowhere, which is basically the point, but again, the second act didn't have any build up to this. Following her kidnapping, Sophie is exposed over several weeks to a trauma-inducing experience that's almost painfully well written. Her and Dex get rescued by a telepath that eats fruit to disguise himself as an old guy. The two kids get lost in Paris. Dex realizes that he might have a special ability, which has been foreshadowed throughout the book. And there's a weird comment about Indian dress. Nappers show up again. Taken home anyway, but Sophie almost dies on the way back. She's unconscious for a while after that, and when she does wake up, there's a big reunion with her friends and family and stuff, and now she has to go to court. At the trial, Sophie doesn't apologize for almost dying to save an entire city of humans, as she should. Then she almost gets expelled from school, but her teachers come to her aid because there are loopholes in the rules for some reason. This happens too quickly, but I guess it makes sense for pacing reasons. Sophie gets adopted by Grady and Edelin. The book ends. This book was an amazing setup for the rest of the series, but because of its jerky second act, it was sort of confusing. I don't mind a few pacing issues, but I wish we could have seen more scenes with Sophie's foster family and information about the Black Swan during that section. It had excellent world building and the beginnings of a very complex and large-scale conflict. Overall, Keeper Book 1 was good, but this isn't a review of every individual book in the series, so let's move on. Like the first installment in the series, Exile has a strong beginning, but it's soon forgotten when the narrative takes a sharp turn. It begins with Sophie discovering a creature thought extinct, a one-of-a-kind alicorn, and then the rest of the first act, which is a while, is mostly just Sophie learning about the alicorn and trying to keep it from getting kidnapped by her class bully. There's a chapter where she talks with Dex about their kidnapping and Dex's physical and mental trauma, which has no purpose except to make me cry when I realize how it connects to his character arc. Then the book takes a nosedive, and suddenly it's about Sophie trying to save her crush's dad from pseudo-dying. This plot is nonsensical in the worst possible ways. The themes of the original book were about compassion and family and belonging. The themes of this book are that Sophie has to fix her abilities, which somehow got damaged at the end of the first book, so that she can save a guy. Barely connects to the first book's themes of empathy and belonging at all, which is a problem that book 3 has too. The final chapters are about Sophie being comfortable with her new abilities and strengths, which I guess makes sense thematically, but aside from having no connection to Sophie's character arc in the previous book, it's also useless character growth because they ditched that mindset immediately in book 3. After reading the later books in the series, I have to give books 2 and 3 credit where it's due, because at least they have action in them. About the action in book 3. Everblaze has a lot of it, not like it begins with any. Sophie canonically can't do anything, so her and Keith have a lot of conversations, and they think that Keith's dad is one of the bad guys. Don't know how that would take up half the book, but the So-Keith conversations do have a tendency to get obnoxiously long. The Elven Council wants Sophie and Fitz to heal the mind of a war criminal because Sophie healed Fitz's dad last book, and the Council doesn't want their dear friend to say pseudo-dad because, I don't know, maybe he was innocent. Eventually they get to the healing plot, and Sophie and Fitz start preparing for the big day together. Very shapy moments on that side as well, plus Fitz getting actual development. The healing comes not long after it's initially announced, and they're in danger already. Some guy dies. Sophie is sad. A city gets burned down. Fintan, the guy they healed, is also pronounced dead after he burns down half a city in his sleep. At some point before or after the healing plot, Keith discovers that he's wearing a tracker which was given to him by his dad. There's a short battle scene. Stuff happens. Can you tell this book is hard to explain in writing? After the healing and this thing where the Ogre King visits a funeral and almost sends Sophie to his capital to work, the council decides that Sophie can't be trusted anymore. This only makes sense because of the funeral scene. The king almost threatened war on the elves, and Sophie made a mistake that got him even angrier. So the council orders her to wear a circlet that restricts her abilities, and then she has to put it on in front of basically the entire elven world. It's humiliating, painful, and, well, restricting. The author describes the experience better than I could. I don't really want this video to get privated, so just read the book. There's a line in the chapter where Sophie compares the experience to having ADD, and yeah, she's completely right. But the kicker here is that the circlet was designed by none other than Dex Disney. For his whole life, Dex has lived with not only the hatred of people that look down on his parents for being a bad match, but also the want to prove that notion wrong. When he figured out he was a technopath, he was disappointed and tried to hide it because he thought it wasn't special enough, even though he had already exceeded expectations by manifesting an ability at all. He wanted to be as special as Sophie. Dex wanted to be recognized for his talent, put on a pedestal, to show the world that they were wrong about him for certain, which made him prone to being pulled into things by the council because they told him that he was special. That he knew the ability restrictor he was making was going to be used on Sophie. He was just told that it was going to be used for the bad guys. Of course, he feels a lot of guilt when he finds out that it was for Sophie all along, which, I mean, that doesn't really make sense, because Sophie got the ability restrictor like a couple weeks after the funeral, where I said it was the reason that she got the ability restrictor put on. Whatever. God, I love Dex's character in the first 3 books. Just wow. If you're sick of me talking about Dex, don't worry, you won't hear much of him later. The Black Swan plans an ambush at Mount Everest of all places. Sophie can't go because she has a mental disorder now, so they arrange for Fitz, Biana, and Keith to go in her place. The plan is to lead Keith's dad, who they think is in the Neverseen still, into an ambush where the Black Swan has attack moles ready to fight on site. Keith feeds his dad just the right amount of information that they need for the ambush to work. To distract herself from her horrible mental state, Sophie makes it even worse by reading journals written by her late adoptive sister. She finds out that the sister's fiancé was part of the evil group that kidnapped Sophie, who she's recently figured out the name of, the Neverseen. She tells Grady about this, who's her adoptive dad, if you forgot, so did I, and he's reasonably mad about it. He's cared for the fiancé, whose name is Brant, for the 16 years since Jolie died. So he goes with Sophie to where Brant lives. There's a big confrontation. Grady burns off his hand. Dex shows up. He throws Sophie's restrictor into the fire. Brant gets away. Brant did trade some valuable information for his escape, though. Apparently the Neverseen know more than they're supposed to know about the planned Mount Everest, which is about to start, and they're not going to go easy on a group of teens. Being a sane being at this point in the series, Sophie immediately rushes to Mount Everest with no preparations, which sets a record for fastest almost death in the series. There's a big battle where several people are injured. It ends with Sophie finding out a dark secret. Keith's dad isn't actually in the Neverseen, it's his mom that's in the Neverseen. Then she jumps off a cliff so that the main characters can revisit the shocking twist at a later date. Lady Gazella makes sense as a twist villain. It's not a Disney type thing where it makes no sense that she's suddenly the villain. My main problem with her as the villain is that she doesn't have any motivations or backstory. She still doesn't, even since Nightfall when she transitioned into the main villain role. Her motivations for being evil are still ridiculously vague, and there's no hint of any past experiences that back those motives up. When the gang returns to their homes, the council has already figured out that Dex destroyed the ability restrictor and then lets Sophie run off to beat up some bad guys. So Sophie has to run away to join the Black Swan so the council won't find her, along with Fitz, Biana, Dex, and Keith. A little extreme, but whatever. It leads to a nice change of scenery. And my favorite book in the series. Book 4, Never Seen, opens up a few hours at most after the last book ended. Alden tells Sophie that the council's already started voting on her punishment, which means that they have to leave right now. Before she goes, though, she gets a visit from Counselor Orally, who gives Sophie the secrets of her past lover and promptly leaves. For the gang to find the Black Swan's hideout that they're staying at, they go on an adventure through Rome. There, they experience the magic of gelato and unclothed statues. The book talks about the human situation that the series hasn't mentioned since book 1. All good so far. They find Mr. Forkle, who they figured out was a member of the Black Swan disguised as Sophie's human neighbor for most of her life, and go to their runaway place. The hideout is called a Louveteer, and it's basically just 2 pretty tree houses. There are several gnomes there that work with the Black Swan. One of them is named Kala, and she forms a bond with Sophie over the course of the book. According to Mr. Forkle, there's currently a plague spreading around a gnome colony, which obviously makes her freak out. This effectively sets up the conflict for the rest of the book. The gang makes their oath to join the Black Swan. Then they go and meet the other leaders of the Black Swan, who are called the Collective as the group. There's Squall the Froster with a busy home life, Blur the Phaser, Granite the Telepath, and Wraith the Vanisher. Then they start preparing to break into exile so they can rescue Prentice. He is a former member of the Black Swan who has a lot of mystery surrounding him and a shattered sanity. Granite helps Sophie and Fitz work on telepathy exercises together. The plague's spreading, but the gang doesn't act on it yet. The only time they do investigate is when Sophie and Biana go with Kala to inspect some trees. There's a never-seen guy who probably went to the bad kid elf school. They leave. At the break-in, the council shows up just when they're about to free Prentice. Things escalate quickly, which leads to Fitz being impaled by a bug. This is more coherent in the actual book. Sophie still wants to break Prentice out, so she bargains with the late Counselor Kenlick's secrets, threatening to give them to other species until the council agrees. They say that the gang still has to go to Exilium as punishment for breaking into a prism, though. While Fitz recovers, the gang prepares to start at Exilium, the bad school, with even worse living conditions than we thought. One day, they even arrive at school to find a forest overrun with the plague. Gnomes are protesting at Eternalia, the elven capital, because the council is doing basically nothing to stop this. So the council says the ogres are the ones causing the plague, which is true and everyone believes for some reason. Also, Fintan isn't dead. Back at Exilium, Sophie meets a pair of twins, Tam and Lynn, who had been taken in by the gnomes at Wildwood after their parents kicked Lynn out because they didn't want to move houses. The twins are both powerful in their abilities, but Lynn can't control her water ability that well. Wildwood is the first place that got hit by the plague, which means more trauma. Sophie thinks she needs their abilities to break into the ogre capital, Ravagog, so they reluctantly join the gang and move to a dead dwarf's house. Deaths from the gnome plague seem pretty imminent, so Sophie wants to steal the cure from Ravagog. They also temporarily recruit Fitz and Biana's older brother, Alvar, because he knows his way around the city. There's a plan in motion, and it all seems good. Then they actually break in, and there's no cure. The ogres don't have a cure. Lynn floods the city with no casualties to the gang after they escape, but they forget that they've flooded and wiped out half a city. Kala the gnome that I mentioned at the beginning of this book realizes that the only way to make a cure is self-sacrifice, which turns her into a mythical tree. She does exactly that. It's sad, the gnomish race is saved. None of the gnomes actually died from the plague, which makes it feel like there's no sense of stakes or urgency that really justifies breaking into Ravagog. This really sucks, especially since the series had already killed off a character in the last book and could totally do it there. That's my biggest problem with this book, though. There's so much stuff dumped onto the reader, but it isn't overwhelming because it all ties into the main plot of the Gnome Plague in some way. Speaking of the plot, I love it because it's so unique and different from the previous installments in the series. Because the gang had to run away and can't go back to any of the locations they've already been to, it places them in a completely different environment with new characters and conflicts. The characters themselves are all over the place in this one. Lynn and Tam are well thought out, but 2D at best. Fitz has some opportunities for character development, but those scenes half end up only as plot fodder. Dex doesn't really do anything, though it was nice to see him make up with Fitz. Keith is great. I loved seeing his experiences with his parents and how Sophie reacted to them as well. Sophie herself is pretty consistent, or as consistent as she can get anyway. Beyond is entertaining. Throughout the book, it's implied that she's jealous of Keith, but it's never mentioned if she's jealous of Sophie having borderline romantic interactions with Keith, or vice versa. This has continued in the later books, and Beyond has still never said if she has an unrecorded crush on Keith or Sophie, though it's obvious that it's one or the other. In Nightfall, she does say that she wishes she would be able to show her feelings for the mystery Keith person. So Sophie assumes that she's talking about Keith, but I don't want to make biased assumptions, but it's definitely more likely that she has a crush on Sophie. Besides how Sophiana ties way better into Beyonce's actual character arc, the author could absolutely be saving a gay ship reveal for the last book. Last episode gays are pretty common in kids' TV shows like The Legend of Korra, Adventure Time, Amphibia, etc. It would be almost expected for Keeper to do the same in Book 10. The gang is welcomed back to the Lost Cities after flooding Ravagog, and they receive full pardons because, as we already know, the Council loves xenophobia. Keith runs away to the Neverseen, and Fitz-in beyond his brother is forced to reveal himself as the member of the Order. Didn't see that one coming. The book ends with Mr. Forkle and Granite revealing their obvious secret identities to Sophie and telling her that Prentice is awake. And now on to Book 5, Lodestar. Sophie and the gang are back at Foxfire, and they've just had finals and are celebrating when Sophie gets called to the principal's office. Keith is there, remember he joined the Neverseen, and he tells Sophie that he joined the Neverseen so he could try to get more information about the group. It's a pretty bad plan, but Sophie immediately tells him. Then he blows up the office and leaves. There are a few more small scattered attacks from the Neverseen. Dex decides to start investigating Alvaro's registry records to see if he can find anything helpful. Foxfire's on summer break, I think. A few people, including Sophie, search Keith's old room while playing the only girls versus boys game I didn't cringe at ever. After the Foxfire incident, Sophie stays in touch with Keith through her telepathy. He tells her that the Neverseen is planning an attack on her parents for a specific date. Everyone freaks out, and Sophie goes to a sleepover at Dex's house so she doesn't get hurt. While she's there, she figures out that Dex's mom is in the Black Swan. Dex is obviously mad at himself for not figuring that out, so the gang distracts themselves by searching Alvar's records together. Then Dex figures out that Keith's phone has a hidden recording device in it that lets his evil mom listen to his conversations and gives him a way to contact her. When they get back, nothing's happened to Grady and Needle, and everyone's relieved. The council's decided to make every Elven family go to a new and improved version of Exilium for combat training with Elven skills. Skills aren't used by elves that often because every elf is born with them and they like the special abilities more because there's a designated hierarchy behind that. Most people aren't very good at using them because of that. Sophie is told that she can bring down an entire city with a skill if she sat in solitude for long enough, which will be important later. After that, there's a bunch of rapid-fire action where more unimportant side characters get pulled into the plot. Wiley's kidnapped by the Neverseen and interrogated about his mom for some reason, which is weird because Prentice is his dad. Marilla offers the gang information about his mom's death so she can trigger an ability that will help her care for her mom, who basically has BPD but worse, and probably caused by the Neverseen. Sophia also gets another ability triggered. The death of Wiley's mom, whose name is Syra, still hasn't been explained fully as of the 9th series installment. Neither have the circumstances of Prince's mind getting broken. It got replaced with another plot, but we'll get to that when the time comes. Tam figures out how to access the Neverseen's hideout network. There's a small fight scene where some bad guys end up getting locked up in a prison below Luminaria. Now Sophie's adoptive parents have finally been attacked while Sophie's linguistics teacher was visiting. Grady's goblin bodyguard was killed while she fought off the attackers, who happened to be ogres that were apparently rebels, which isn't suspicious at all. After that happened, the leaders of the intelligent species, which are elves, dwarves, gnomes, trolls, goblins, and ogres, decided to have a peace summit in Luminaria. They're still deciding the date when Sophie and Counselor Orally visit a Neverseen member in his cell, and he has genuinely terrifying dialogue. When the peace summit finally does come, Sophie's there along with Edelin and Mr. Forkle to represent the Black Swan, or because she's special or something. The Ogre King talks about how the Neverseen forced him to unleash the plague because he wanted to protect his kingdom or something. He also says that the Ogre rebels were actually going after Sophie's teacher, not her family, because the teacher tried to talk the Ogre King out of accepting the Neverseen's offer. He also mentions how Sophie got a full pardon from the death penalty or something because she whipped out half a city, which I did find strange, but the council is really xenophobic again. Then Fintan, yes, the villain who got his mind healed in Book 3, shows up out of nowhere and barges into the Peace Summit before the leaders can sign the treaty that the Ogre King agreed to. He gets nervous and tries to stall the process. Then, out of nowhere, he starts talking about the problems with humans. Yes, humans. The conflict that has only been touched on during Lodestar in one chapter near the beginning. It's so confusing, even though you know that Fintan was just trying to get the leaders to start arguing. And it doesn't even serve as a good lead into the final scene either. Later that evening, Sophie figures out what the Neverseen are trying to do. They're going to blow up Luminaria. I'm not even kidding, they're trying to blow up a whole city with every world leader inside. Sophie managed to get mostly everyone out. A lot of goblins are reported to be dead, but that doesn't have any emotional impact besides, oh crap, a lot of people died. Mr. Forkle dies, which Sophie does witness, and that's an okay scene, I guess. Then Keith shows up out of nowhere saying that he's escaped from the Neverseen and tells Sophie that her human family's probably dead. So they rush off with Fitz and Alden to that family's new house and find Sophie's little sister, Amy, alone in there. The Neverseen have kidnapped Sophie's human parents. Lodestar is weird for me, and I'm sure other fans feel the same way. I've seen comments about how forgettable the book is, despite its action and number of character deaths. I think that's because it serves as more of a bridge between books 4 and 6. There's no self-contained story arc like in the previous books. It serves as a starting point for bigger plots like Cyrus' death, Sophie's human family, Fintan's Lodestar initiative, and whatever the heck Keith's mom is doing. The main cast is mostly useless in Book 5 besides Keith, especially in terms of personality. Not even Fitz, even though this is a book assigned so Fitz up fandom. He has a couple lines where he's an jerk and is actually nice to people, and they could be connected to his relationship with Alvar, who, is never seen, but the book doesn't mention that at all. He gets no development. Okay, there's like a line in the first chapter where it says Fitz won't talk about Alvar or Keith, but before I started rereading the series, I'd assumed that Flashback was the turning point for the mediocrity in the series, maybe Nightfall, but even though Lodestar is far from mediocre, it's still the start of the second part of the Keeper series in some sense. Keeper is no longer a series of plots separated by books. Lodestar serves a bigger purpose, the beginning of a grand, complex plot that is only separated into books by the climaxes at the end. That's not the case for Book 6, but it's a pattern that'll form for the books to come after it. The characters are no longer working towards a big goal with high stakes that they either will or won't reach by the end of the book. They're just trying to advance their game against the Neverseen, and a big battle just happens to come to be the climax. So anyway, about all those loose ends at the end of Lodestar. How will the Black Swan cope with the death of their leader? What happened to Sophie's human parents and her sister Amy? How does King Demetar's character arc actually make sense? I bet you'll never guess the answer. Nightfall picks up right where Lodestar left off, continuing the same scene immediately after the last line is spoken. It's logical. Amy has an identity crisis over what her real name is, and wants to tell Sophie about what happened to her mom and dad. And yet, something feels very different from the previous books. There's a heightened sense of romance. It's unexplained, but so obvious. Sophie is more aware of her relationships with Fitz and Keith. There's more flirting and passive-aggressive fighting over Sophie. The previous books had a bit of a love triangle going on, and Sophie had a semi-crush on Fitz. But now those feelings have been amplified times 100. It's so weird and not explained. Even when Sophie goes to talk to Amy in private about her experience in the Lost Cities a few chapters later, they have a nice conversation that makes sense until Amy starts stripping Keith, and then it gets really, really awkward. A few days later, the Black Swan has arranged a meeting with Sophie and the gang to discuss the contingency plan for dealing with Mr. Forkle's death. Contingency, God, okay. Before Sophie leaves her house, Keith has another long conversation with her, and then the whole gang comes over, including Lynn and Tam. Dex and Fitz start arguing with Keith over Sophie, and then they leave. Mr. Forkle isn't actually dead. He was a pair of twins that went by the same name because the elves don't like multiple births, so they just pretended they were one guy. Only one twin is dead, and the other gets yelled at for making Sophie sad. After that, Dex confesses his crush on Sophie, and she dumps him. That makes things really awkward between them, so Sophie just ignores him, and now he's out of the plot. Sophie and Keith investigate into what the Neverseen are doing to her mom and dad. They have to contact Keith's evil mom for information, which they do like 5 times in the book. Doesn't sound like a lot, but those conversations are really long because, again, they have Keith in them. Keith gets a convenient flashback that shows the location of his facility named Nightfall. To break into Nightfall, the gang needs a pyrokinetic to kill the mutant creatures that are guarding it. But since pyrokinesis is banned, the Black Swan doesn't know any people with that ability besides Marilla, who conveniently got that ability triggered by Mr. Forkle in the last book. They fight Nightfall, there's preparation and stealth, and everything's going well, except there's nothing there. This is one of the only scenes in the entire book that had potential for action, but it had to disappoint. The only real action scene besides the climax is when Keith makes the incredibly wise choice to fight the Ogre King because Keith's mom said to. Keith only barely wins by using his wits and finding loopholes as usual, getting severely injured in the process. As his mom's letter states, Dimitar makes his daughter Ro become Keith's bodyguard. The letter also talks about Keith's quote-unquote legacy, which Gazella has mentioned way too many times at this point and will continue to talk about. Keith goes on bed rest to heal his injuries and only returns right as everyone else figures out the location of the other Nightfall because of course there are 2 of them. They plan a break-in involving way too many characters, and we move on to the climax. Oh, the climax. How do I put this lightly? The climax of Nightfall is spectacular. There's a huge amount of people involved in it, but the book gives everyone a little bit to do, so it doesn't feel overwhelming. Except Dex, who honestly does nothing. The whole climax is long, but they go to different places in Atlantis throughout the battle and do different things, so it's paced surprisingly well. At one point, a member of the Neverseen breaches the force field protecting Atlantis from the ocean that surrounds it. Lynn has flooded Atlantis before, on accident, and became scared of her power after that, but she's the only one who's strong enough to fix it. She takes a risk and plugs the hole with the help of Keith and Sophie, showing the water that she controls it now. Lady Gazelle makes a lesbian alliance with a wanted criminal that's several thousand years old. The gang retrieves Sophie's mom and dad from Nightfall along with Vinchan and Alvar, who are both conveniently unconscious. The human family stuff following that isn't very interesting, but there are some moderately okay emotional lines. Then Alvar wakes up in his prison hut and has amnesia. End of book 6. This book is so intriguing to me because of how different it is from the rest of the series. Not just with the shipping weirdness or the tiny amount of action, but also because of its focus on the characters. All the main characters get to be fleshed out in some way, like when Sophie has to visit Tam and Lynn's parents' house, and the twins have to deal with their conflicting feelings towards them. Or when Dex talks about how long he's had a crush on Sophie, and how hopeful he was that she reciprocated his feelings. Reciprocated? Or when Biana tells Sophie that she has a crush on someone but she can't be with them because that person only has eyes for someone else. The list goes on, and I'm glad the book took the time to develop these characters that don't get focused on enough because they're not love interests later on. Again, the shipping here and the amount of it is just way overboard from what I want. Oh man, did you say shipping? I bet you love shipping. Here, have a ridiculous amount of shipping. Flashback opens at Alvar's criminal trial, which goes horribly wrong. Fitz's family is very big and prestigious and obsessed with reputation, so none of them want to be here, and they all hate Fitz and Biana for ruining their honor or something. The council feels pressured on some level by that, so they just sentence Alvar to stay next to his family's house for 6 months. Fitz is extremely mad about this, and Biana isn't much better. Then Fitz and Sophie randomly get attacked by 3 Neverseen members, and a shadow ability guy shoots them with some weird shadows, which almost kills them. Tam saves them because he is also a shadow guy, but Fitz and Sophie now have to be stuck in the healing center on bed rest for several weeks. Many weeks. That time that Sophie spends in there surprisingly isn't too bad. Fitz finally gets to have his character fleshed out, and I genuinely started shipping Sophitz like I had upon first reading the series. There isn't a lot of plot during this chunk of the book, but the characters still do things that contribute to the plot. There's a lot of time given to developing Sophie, Keith, and Fitz as individual characters. There's not a lot of effort put into the other characters, but their few appearances aren't too bad either. This section is sweet and slow-paced paced, but in a good way that made me really enjoy the conversations between characters. Then we enter the second half of the book, and as soon as Sophie returns home, things go downhill fast. There's so much conflict and exposition and drama and suspense dumped on you all at once that it's overwhelming and downright unenjoyable. This wouldn't have been an issue if the conflict had been introduced near the start of the book, since a self-contained storyline with an unfamiliar species worked great in Neverseen. But not only that, but the book manages to completely wreck Fitz's character arc, which was totally human and three-dimensional and relatable during the Bedra segment, but now he's unnecessarily ruthless. He tries to kill his brother multiple times. And even when there could have been an emotional moment where Sophie told him, "I don't want to lose you, I don't want the guilt to break you," that somehow never happened. It isn't that hard. It's like the book wanted the entire fandom to start hating Fitz, which it does, even to this day. Actually, rereading this part of the script makes me realize that perhaps I treated Fitz in Flashback B too harshly. Oh my god, that was a terrible Thanos impression. It's understandable that Fitz values the matchmaking process, which is another hierarchical construct that the elves made, more than Keith does, because Keith was brought up in a way that made him hate society and the status quo, and Fitz wasn't, which is completely understandable. It's fine that Fitz is a little more traditional and trusts the rules more than Keith. The rules may be unfair to others, but that's not what Fitz was taught, and he trusts his parents, at least on a more basic level than Keith, who has never trusted or liked his parents. Fitz isn't perfect, but he isn't evil or a jerk. Keeper fans don't understand this is why I'm so mad. There's a lot of Fitz hate that you'll find in the fandom, but they just really need to chill out. Back to the story, they've never seen talk, and talk, and talk. Then they threaten to kill Silva, so Tam is taken to join the Neverseen, so that's avoided. After the battle, Sophie cracks from the pressure from Fitz in society, so she visits the matchmakers, and oops, she's unmatchable. Well, that sucks. Anyway, well, now on to... Oh no. Oh no. So how do I talk about this without getting myself cancelled somehow? Yeah, screw it. Legacy is mediocre and messy and overall just a pile of trash. None of the scenes are impactful or emotional, at least like the good ones from any other Keeper book. Ro and Dex are funny individually, which I guess is sort of why Ro got introduced in book 6. It took the author that long to figure out that Keith's jokes weren't even funny. And Dex, yeah, he also makes a bunch of jokes. I guess he's comic relief now. And then Sophie joins this team created by the council called Team Valiant. I get why Team Valiant exists, so it can show how the council is trusting the Black Swan, but Sheena has no business being part of it. She was the annoying generic bully in book 1. She got redeemed in book 4. She doesn't need to be redeemed anymore. She was a terrible character to start with, and there's enough characters in the series at this point that no one needs to be reminded of her existence at all. It is funny to see her having to deal with Dex and Biana's stupidity though. I guess they're mature now. I don't know what happened. The love triangle is pushed to an insane degree in this book. Sophie and Fitz are dating, but Sophie can't be with him that often, and she ends up being a jerk to pretty much everyone around her. I understand her motivations for being a jerk, but I had to keep reminding myself how stressed she is and how much she has to juggle in this installment. You can't leave the main character's morality up to the reader's own judgment, at least not like that. Make it just a little more convincing that Sophie isn't being a bad person for no reason. I'm not sure why I'm even being this harsh of a critic, because when you read the acknowledgements with the author's Instagram post from the year Legacy was published, it's clear that Shannon Messenger is projecting her horrible burnout onto a self-insert character. It might just sound like a conspiracy theory, but of course this 800-page book was written terribly. It was made in under a year. All the Keeper books have that timeline for publishing, but as they keep getting longer and longer, you're starting to see the quality go down exponentially. I'm going to go with the obvious judgment of this and say that she's being put on insane deadlines by her publisher to make the maximum profit for her series. I mean, I bet the sales aren't going down that much, since the fans keep getting hyped every year and hoping this book is better than the last. Back in the story, Mr. Forkle gives Sophie a missing memory back, along with her sister. She gets her abilities healed, again, so that she can use her inflicting without the Neverseen blocking her. This also makes it harder for Sophie to stop enhancing other people's abilities. She got that ability triggered in book 5 and it's been useful since then, but she's had to wear gloves so she doesn't enhance everyone she touches. That doesn't work anymore, so Counselor Orally teaches her how to turn it off and accidentally reveals that she's Sophie's biological mom. By the way, Sophie's trying to figure out her biological parents because that's why she's unmatchable and she has to get a match list, I guess. Shipping. Mr. Forkle finds out that Lady Gazelle might have killed a man. Keith and Sophie get curious enough about this to drag Fitz on an adventure throughout London, where Lady Gazelle actually shows up, along with our old friend and unwilling fugitive Tabsong, who told Sophie telepathically earlier in the book that he was being ordered to hurt Keith. Sophie uses her shiny new inflicting on Gazelle so no one gets hurt, but yeah, that wasn't a smart idea to bring Keith in the first place. Then, before we know it, we're in the third act, and we finally find out the true purpose of Keith's legacy. Sophie tells Gazelle that she's found the memories of Gazelle making her husband drink a bunch of weird light and shadow vials, which Gazelle says is something called Deltarune. She found the memories through Keith's father, which was not a pleasant scene in general. From book 2 and beyond, Keeper has a lot of mindscape scenes like the one with Keith's dad, which is basically just like dredging up old memories, and it really isn't pleasant for me, maybe just because I can't see stuff in my head. Using light and weird shadows because I guess the normal shadows didn't have any purpose before then, Keith gets put into a coma and Elwyn says he's probably getting a new ability. Tell me this is something that happens to anyone besides the protagonist of a series. The Keith stands were strong enough that they convinced the author to make him a main character somehow. The plot that made this happen I'll call the Deltarune plot, since that seems to be what made him get his new abilities. Starting in maybe book 6, this plot is pushing aside a lot of the other plots that were important before, like Prentice. We still don't know what the heck happened with him. Starting in book 6, we also begin to shift away from Fintan or Brant as a villain, and more on Lady Gazelle as a villain. And compared to the emotional value of their stories, Lady Gazelle doesn't really work for me as the main villain. I'd rather focus on the stuff that the series started out with, because I thought it was going at a good direction. After the climax of Legacy, Orly tells Sophie that she recognizes the word Deltarune, which makes them work together to get a memory back. This leads into Keeper Book 8.5, Unlocked. This installment is only a novella at the back of a world guide to the Keeper universe. According to the author, the novella was going to be the beginning of Book 9, but she had to rewrite it so that it would switch between 2 points of view instead of only staying in Sophie's to help the plot flow better. Who's this other perspective the book's being written from? Well, it's none other than Keith Sensen. He's the main character. They aren't even pretending he isn't anymore. Sophie and Orly get the memory from Orly's cache, the little secret holding device. It doesn't relate to Deltarune at all. It's just a memory of Orly's love story with the counselor that died in book 3, who tells her that he knows he's Sophie's biological mom. He also mentions something called Elysian, which we still know nothing about. Sophie shares my reaction to this. Meanwhile, Keith wakes up from his coma with weird new powers, including being able to control people's emotions with vocal commands. He makes Sophie leave him alone so that he doesn't hurt her on accident and moves into the physician's basement. He also makes Dex test out gadgets and elixirs on him to control his ability. Dex brings his triplet siblings over to annoy Keith one day, which is how he figures out that he can also tell other people's abilities, including the ones that haven't manifested. He also realizes that one of Dex's siblings might be talentless, which hits Dex really hard. That's the breaking point for Keith, and he runs away to the forbidden cities where humans live. On Sophie's side of things, Fitz gets redemption. Sort of. Then Sophie finds a conveniently unregarded Neverseen storehouse, gets the things she needs, and burns it down. Why did the Neverseen have no security for the storehouse, where they put literally all their important items? Shouldn't they have a person keeping watch? Gazelle had some sort of alarm system for the spot in London where she hid a leaping crystal, so why didn't she even have one of those here? Did nobody notice when Glimmer stole the rare starstone that led to the storehouse full of priceless and crucial objects? I'm sure this will be explained in Book 9. Definitely. I've heard people complain that this scene has Sophie deciding to go on the offense for the 3rd time in the series. Yeah, that's a problem, but this scene is also the first time when Sophie really has one up on the Neverseen. Every time she thought she'd outsmarted them, she'd just fallen into another trap. This time, though, she actually has won something, with no compromises. Not that the premises of this scene are dumb, but it isn't a useless scene either. To wrap it up, the latter half of the Keeper series is structured in a way where the books don't have a single plot, but rather dozens of converging plots that start in random places and are sometimes broken up by books that lead into each other more than the first 4 did. There's clearly a lack of pre-planning between them, though. In the book Neverseen, it's implied several times that the Black Swan is planning to eventually have Sophie, Fitz, Keith, Biana, and Dex to lead the organization. This is supposed to cement these characters as the main 5 of the series that the story will revolve around. But by book 7, Biana and Dex are only appearing for a few chapters. They've been overshadowed because the author has realized that other characters will have to have the spotlight instead for plot and character development. That was my dog calling out the door. What was supposed to be a big moment in Neverseen has just become completely pointless. And that's pretty sad. This will be short, but I still wanted to address these issues in the book since they're a common trend in the series. I already suggested pacing changes for book 1 in that book section. For book 2, I think that the trip to exile should have come a little sooner, and definitely after Sophie started her next level at Foxfire. For book 3, there definitely should have been more build-up to Fintan's healing, and the conversations between Keith and Sophie in the first half could be kept much shorter. Book 4's pacing issues are pretty much identical to book 2's. The exile break-in felt like it came too late, or at least the main gang should have started going to Exilium before it happened, but both of those changes are probably very difficult to implement. For book 5, there wasn't a lot of tension and build-up to the Peace Summit, and again, definitely not enough build-up for the last chapter to happen. Book 6 had basically no action until the 10 out of 10 climax, so there isn't much to say on that one. In book 7, Sophie obviously spent too much time doing nothing on bed rest, which likely led to the huge clusterfuck of the ending. Book 8 was obviously... Actually, I'm not sure how it could have been paced better. Book 8.5 had excellent pacing on the other hand, aside from the first 2 chapters, which are both needlessly long. A thing that gets painfully obvious when you read the series in order is how the pacing is gradually stretched out. The books were never paced very well, but once you get to Flashback or Legacy, the conversations are so boring to read and they drag on way longer than they should. I'm not sure if this was because these books are half-revised first drafts or just because they had to have a long page count in order to sell more copies. Either way, sometimes this makes the book really unenjoyable to read, and honestly pretty boring. But we've only shown a tiny bit of the delicious paradox that is Keeper of the Lost Cities. It's time for the main course. I've been waiting to get to this topic for the entire video so far because I think it's extremely interesting to look at the concept of a love triangle in a kids' book series. Or, more accurately, a love triangle but Dex is also there. This is not 2 but 3 male characters competing for the female protagonist. I've already went over how the 3 most explored ships have functioned in the main storyline, so we're moving on from that subject. If you need a summary, I'm putting it on screen as a timeline, but the basic gist is that Sophie and Keith have long conversations from book 2 onward. Book 6 randomly turns Keeper into a romance series. Book 7 is Sophitz and then storyline whiplash that ends with Fitz getting bad character treatment, so Keith becomes the main character and love interest at the same time. Keeper book 1 didn't have a hint of a love triangle, but book 2 suddenly found Sophie spending a lot more time with Keith. So Keith was introduced mostly unprovoked, and that's why I dislike it as a ship. Keith is a fan favorite as well, being the traumatized white boy of the series, but, well, it's unnecessary for him to be in a relationship with Sophie for him to cure his parental trauma. The introduction of Keith into the overarching plot seems sloppy and rushed because Keith didn't even show up that much in the first book, and he was first described in his tone just as romantic as Fitz was. Besides this, the Sophitz aspect of the love triangle seems forced and choppy too. This is mostly just a problem with Sophie's character inconsistencies, though. Most of Keith and Sophie's character development is not earned, and Fitz's development is just all over the place. Between the concept of matchmaking in the Lost Cities, arranged marriages like the one between Beau and Ro the Ogres, and of course Brent and Jolie's unmatchable marriage, it seems like there's some sort of commentary that the series is trying to give. It might be commentary on arranged marriages, but the prejudice of matchmaking in the Lost Cities revolves around racism against talentless people and pyrokinetics, not the arranged marriages themselves. It's a romance-flavored commentary on racism. The matchmaking concept is also about the stuck-up social elite, people who value reputation over their own desires. This isn't commentary, it's just an overdone thing in kids' media. You know, like, rich people are bad and stuck up and mean.
The series presents itself as something that's trying to give you groundbreaking social commentary, but it's just stuff like racism is bad. Rich people are usually selfish and mean. It's not anything new or groundbreaking, it's just stuff you can find in a lot of media. The only time that real-life social issues are actually mentioned is when Sophie talks about how she doesn't want to wear a dress. And Della, who's Fitz's mom and sort of serves as a role model in the book this is in, never seen, says that she shouldn't worry about gender roles or fitting into them like usual because sexism doesn't exist in the Lost City. And that's the only time this is ever mentioned. The Keeper series is ultimately a series about social change and having to reconstruct a broken system. But the only systems needing change that the series provides are fictional, fake, stuff that doesn't matter in our real world and won't have any impact. Okay, note to self, none of that was scripted. Please move it to the racism segment. Please, please, please. Sophie's unmatchable and can't receive a match list, so whoever dates her will have to deal with the fact that they are a bad match. Keith wants to actively rebel against his father, who's obsessed with his reputation and himself. Keith has no problem with being a bad match because he doesn't care about what his father thinks. He would actually be happier if his abusive dad didn't like his choice. But Fitz cares a lot about having Sophie on his match list. Sure, he also cares about Sophie, but he keeps the match ranking in mind because he cares about how others will treat him. He is shown to have a lot of anxiety about what strangers think of him, which is completely valid. Sophie thinks this is a bad thing, and she pushes Fitz away because of it. It's not like Fitz doesn't want to date and marry her, he's afraid of being rejected by elves in society based on his upbringing. Keith doesn't have a problem with this, but this is just because he feels like it wouldn't impact him if he were rejected by society as a whole. He doesn't care about what the outside world thinks of him, which is shown even in book 1, making him slightly consistent, and therefore one of the most consistent characters in the series. Fitz's views on matchmaking are different, but his reasons why he accepts it boil down to social anxiety and an upbringing opposite to Keith's. That doesn't make him evil. Oh wait, yes it does, I guess. Like I previously mentioned, Fitz doesn't really get any character development in the 2 books before or after book 7. He just wants to protect Keith and Sophie, and the little dialogue that he gets revolves around either that or it's just stuff that has nothing to do with his actual character. There's a scene in book 8 that shows how absolutely bonkers the love triangle has made the people involved in it. It's directly after Sophie accidentally discovers the identity of her biological mother, then has a fallout with her. Sophie's obviously upset about it, but then she comes home to Fitz, who's her boyfriend at that point. Fitz pressures Sophie to tell him who her biomom is, but Sophie tells him that he shouldn't know. Telling Fitz who it was would have had very little impact on himself, and he obviously wanted to know very badly. Instead of telling Fitz that she's had a long day and that she'll tell him about it when she's less stressed, Sophie just yells at him until he sadly walks away. I honestly don't see any reason for this breakup other than pushing Soph Keith into canon. Books 8 and 8.5 are both very Keith-centric already, and I could see the series ending with Sophie and Fitz working their problems out together as a couple. I'm saying this probably because of personal preference, but I think we can agree that if your book series pushes the character that was the second most plot important in books 1 and 3 to the side and makes him a two-dimensional background character with very little reasoning behind it, then that is a problem. The Keeper series' romantic aspects only get progressively more extreme, which led the books following book 6 towards a downward spiral of mediocrity and character bias. It isn't the main reason why this happens, as I'll explain in just a minute, but it is a factor. The degree to which Nightfall forces the main ships onto the reader is ridiculous. I guess they had to be randomly implemented for plots further down the line, like the Deltarune and matchmaking plots, which I think will have a major impact on the story in the end. They do end up bringing out a lot of the underlying flaws in the Elven world, but we already learned that the matchmaking system was dumb back in book 3, so weird. Looks like the books are getting progressively more biased towards a certain character and ship which happen to both be fan favorites, and that the books suffer from terrible pacing and character writing. It's almost like the author is under extreme. Before I start rambling again, just keep in mind that I don't know the Keeper series' writer personally, and this is all just my educated guess. Shannon Messenger, the author of Keeper, should not be allowed to look at her own wiki. I don't know what caused the other, but the number of Keef stands in the fandom definitely coincide with Keef's involvement in the series. Fan pressure is a problem in a lot of media, but it really shows in books like Keeper. The first book wasn't ship-centric at all, but as Shannon quickly became aware that people wanted to see a love triangle and find out which ship would be endgame, she felt more pressured to make Keeper about shipping. This led to many characters' plot relevance suddenly only being to a love interest for Sophie, and as soon as Sophie lost interest in them, they were tossed aside. I don't think Keef was always meant to be the second main character, but he's become that because publishing is an industry first and foremost. For the Keeper books to sell, you have to keep the fans interested, so they'll want to buy the next book, and the majority of the Keeper fandom currently is so Keef shippers and Keef stans. That's how marketing works. In order for the later Keeper books to be approved, and for Shannon to make enough money, the best way to do it is to publish something that reads like fanfiction. That's not saying that I think they should be written like that, but when you have a freaking year to write an 800-word novel, you have to make some sacrifices. The later Keeper books are written so poorly, mostly because of the time constraints. Sure, Fitz's crappy treatment in books 7 and beyond are partly because the author might be biased against him, but it was also because she didn't have time to look at his bad decisions and go, wait, would he actually do that with his personality and current motivations? It's clear that if the books are not released every year, people will lose interest in the series and less people will buy them. But it also means that Shannon will have to be constantly typing drafts between releases. She doesn't have time to go back and check for inconsistencies with the characters in the world because she just has to keep typing. If she doesn't type non-stop, skim the draft and make some revisions in less than a year, the series won't sell. Or worse, it'll get ended early. This came to a peak in 2020 when instead of finishing a completed book 9, Shannon could only finish its beginning in time. This became the book 8.5 novella, which accompanied a world guide to the Keeper universe. I've already gone over this book's plot, but it's obvious that this was filler and that Shannon struggled to get even part of book 9 finished in time. Don't get me wrong, there are some really good scenes in book 8.5, but when everything in this book reads like a good fanfic written by someone who kens Keef, that's when you know it has problems. To be chopped up into pieces like this, book 9 has to be either really content heavy or it just couldn't be written the way that it was supposed to be written. This would prompt Shannon to rewrite the beginning of book 9, likely after spending a lot of time and effort on a beginning that wouldn't even work. Prior to book 8.5's release, Shannon would sometimes upload selfies to her Instagram with captions talking about how stressed and sleep deprived she was from her writing deadlines. She's already begun to make similar posts before book 9 releases this year. That's why I'm glad that Simon & Schuster allowed Shannon another year to finish the last 2 Keeper books. And although this is because she recently gave birth back in May 2021, it'll give her more time to think the plot and character arcs over, and 6 extra months to write books 9 and 10 each. I hope she uses this time to write something that I can appreciate and will want to reread years from now, but only time will tell. The big takeaway is that the later Keeper books have a lot of problems with them, but before you start leaving bad reviews, just keep this in mind. The author was under a lot of time restraints, and it's obviously felt pressure from her fans and publisher. Shannon Messenger can't put enough time or thought into what or who she's writing about because she has to put her books out, please the fans, and make money. Not that I'm saying that the publisher's the only one to blame. Let's talk more about Shannon's writing choices, shall we? Now, every fandom has its gay fans. On Keeper's wiki, there are pages for ships, and you can usually find queer ships among the most popular of them. The majority of Keeper fans completely ignore the people who adore Lena or Cam, but those people didn't come unwarranted. Every book in the series has plenty of queer language packed into it. Sophie's first impression of any female character is that the character is physically attractive. Dex was basically forcing himself to hate Fitz and would only call him Wonderboy for the first 3.5 books. Sir Tiergan, a male character, is very heavily implied to have romantic feelings for Prentice. The list goes on and on, but it's never explicitly stated that there are any LGBTQ characters in the series. It's not ever mentioned that Elven society has a bias towards LGBTQ people one way or another, which is strange because the series is about prejudice and how that prejudice impacts the people that are rejected by society because of it. This may seem unnecessary, especially to people who aren't in the community, but when book 8 came out, the only thing keeping me interested attention in the series and what made me want to buy Legacy was the slim possibility that there would be some sort of gay representation. Believe me, I checked. Keeper is about a quiet, nerdy girl coming to a place where she's appreciated for her talents and learning to fight against injustice. Plenty of gay kids love the series because they already see themselves in it. Believe me, I was one of them. Of course they'll jump at any chance to headcanon the characters as their own identities. But when you have this much heavily queer-coded language and still no canon gay or trans characters, it becomes obvious that this is marketed, at least partially, towards queer kids. And yes, all of this that I'm showing on the screen is from book 1 alone. There are so many opportunities for queer representation in the series. Lena, which is the ship of Flynn and Varela, is probably one of the most popular ships in the entire fandom. Apart from Sokeef, trying to figure out what characters will end up with which is like a matching game. Almost every pair is viable, and there are endless combinations of them to choose from. If every character ends the series in a relationship, then it'll be easy for one of those relationships to not be hetero. Another common theory that I see a lot is that Sophie is transgender or non-binary. She prefers to wear androgynous clothing, hates wearing dresses, and may have described gender dysphoria in Lodestar. Of course, this ties into the whole thing about her being not like other girls and different, but these details are something that a lot of trans-masculine people, including myself, could relate to as kids. In the series, that was the main reason that I thought I wasn't transgender. I was just gender non-conforming and feminist as a kid, even though I am transgender and non-binary, as I've been living as a non-binary person for almost 2 years now. I can still relate to Sophie's dialogue with Della in book 4, but it's clear to me now that Sophie's problem with dresses isn't really about gender roles. It's because of personal preference. The fact that she's so flimsily uses sexism as an excuse for not liking dresses is even more of a reason to believe that she's transgender, in my opinion. I know, I'm gonna get mad comments for everything I just said, but in the end, I could relate to this conversation about gender, and many other people could relate to it, because I am transgender. Whether you like it or not, Sophie is queer-coded, as well as Lynn and Marilla, and Keith and Dex, and many others, so you can imagine how strange it was when people in the fandom found out that the artist that made the most official art for Keeper, besides Shannon herself, was allegedly homophobic. I'm using homophobic for this person loosely because although there was evidence that this artist was, in fact, blocking people on Twitter simply because they were openly LGBTQ, this evidence could have been faked relatively easily. It was very difficult for me to find any actual evidence of this artist, Laurel Hollingsworth, being homophobic. Sure, she's a very open and devout Christian, and those people are notorious for homophobia, but that doesn't prove anything. I only ever found allegations about her, things like blocking gay keeper shippers to curate her feed and ignore fandom discourse. I also found people talking about her liking and retweeting posts with hate speech and even openly stating that she would not draw any gay characters. Since she is the main official artist for the Keeper series, this might be part of the reason for queer-coding its characters rather than explicitly making them queer. If that's the case, it might mean upcoming books can solve this problem. I scoured every resource I could find for any evidence proving that Laura was a homophobe and came up empty. It had all been deleted, and only baseless accusations remained. Finally, I found a sliver of proof. I'd come to my last resort for gathering evidence. Laura's Twitter. She never created any tweets saying, "I hate gay people," but she's retweeted many posts that are strangely worded. A surprising amount of political tweets with hate speech and dog whistles laced into it, sometimes unnoticeably. Totalitarians make people say things that are false. What the heck does that mean? She also somewhat recently made fanart for the Chronicles of Narnia, a series that's known to be racist and sexist at times. The list goes on and on. As I scrolled down and saw her retweets, it became very clear that this was not a person who was accepting of some sort of quote-unquote liberal movement, much less someone who wanted to admit that. And this is just her retweets. Laura tweeted in 2013 saying that she was receiving a lot of hate on Tumblr, a site known for its large LGBTQ community and its persistent gay shipping back then. This tweet was made before she started making official Keeper art and only a year after the first book was released, but I feel it's still worth mentioning. I can't confidently say that Laura is a homophobe even after so much research, but when you put the accusations of hate and the hateful dog whistle posts I've just shown, I find it extremely likely.
Okay, so, right when I was about to finish editing this video, I found an entire archive of, tweets, retweets, and likes on Laura's Twitter that basically prove like that she's homophobic and racist and other stuff, and also she made like a bunch of really rude, vague tweets at Shannon and her publisher. So yeah. Uh that basically disproves like the entire point of this section, because I didn't know that when I was making this section.
These years of drama came to a close a mere 3 days before book 8.5 would release, chock full of Laura Hollingsworth's art, when Shannon released an official statement on Instagram. According to the post, Shannon had reconsidered her choices about which artist she would commission for official Keeper art. Quote, "And the reality of the situation is that I can't speak about or on behalf of anyone else. I can only speak for me. And of course it's very important to me that everyone feels welcome and supported in the fandom, including LGBTQIA+ fans. I am always looking to work with new artists, with the goal always being to create art that brings joy to all of my readers." End quote. It's also important to note that Shannon wrote and posted this herself during a period where she was sick and had an assistant write most of her social media stuff, so this was clearly very important in some way. There's nothing directly stated about Laura Hollingsworth or her actions, but it's obviously about her. So Laura isn't being commissioned for Keeper art anymore. Was firing a prominent artist who makes the bulk of your series' art just for blocking a bunch of people on Twitter worth it? Yeah, probably. Laura didn't pose a big threat to the safety of the LGBTQ community because she didn't really speak out openly against them, not like some other well-known queer folks are, but her art is bad anyway. She draws people of color weird. Something's wrong with the jawlines of some characters, and the way she drew these guys will haunt my dreams forever. Since the release of Unlocked, more official art has been posted, and I love it. Laura's art style was mostly smooth, without much attention to details, but these are the opposite. They look like real people. God, I'm in love with this one of Morella. Anyway, now that we've got that cesspit out of the way, I'm sure we don't have any more discrimination or bias to deal with. I'm just kidding, we always have that. Trigger warnings for mentions of racism and racial stereotypes up ahead. Also, I'm not a person of color. First and foremost, the Lost Cities are white. They're not just made up of white people, but its culture is heavily based on European culture. The clothing of the nobility looks like something that someone would wear in France a few centuries ago. Foxfire's school curriculum is like a fantasy world version of 18th century alchemy. This is even to the point that there's an alchemy class that Sophie takes in book 1 that focus on transmuting various materials to metal. To add to this, there's a laughably small number of people of color in book 1. Of course, there's Maruka and Prentice, who were introduced then and had their appearance described in later books. The elves aren't supposed to have racism in their society, at least by skin color. The series does do a bit of a better job later, though. Tam and Lin Song are introduced in the 4th book as lonely twins that are struggling with the shadows of parental abuse and their banishment to Auxilium. They're well-developed characters, and I like them both, but they're introduced in a strange way. When they pull down their hoods and reveal their faces to Sophie, she compares both of them to K-pop stars or characters pulled straight from quote-unquote the animes. K-pop is from Korea and anime is from Japan. Additionally, the twins' last name is of Chinese origin, and both of their first names are Vietnamese. By introducing these characters, both of whom would be very important to the overarching plot from then on, as Pan-Asian stereotypes, yeah, it's not as bad as the Asian rep in like most American media before they were introduced in 2015. The twins being Pan-Asian makes enough sense in the world since the elves don't have countries of origin, or a concept of skin color race like humans do. But this also says a lot about why these characters were introduced. It's clear that Lin and Tam are supposed to be the representation for all Asian readers. The series needed more people of color in its cast, and this is the solution. They're basically saying, this is your Asian representation. This is all you're getting. This is who you can relate to. Now stop yelling at us. And at least that held up. There are also a few black characters that are described as black in their first appearances, but some of the black characters that are mentioned in the first book but aren't described as black until later. Like, there's this character named Wiley who doesn't show up until the second book, but he's mentioned by a couple characters in the first book. Then Sophie, who's this blonde black girl, thinks that Wiley's dad was her father who abandoned her. And then, after she finds out that this isn't true, she meets Wiley in book 2 and he's mixed race. His dad, Prentice, is black. So that means that most of Sophie's existential crisis in book 1 wouldn't have been a problem if Prentice's appearance had been described at all. I don't think that's racially blind or anything, I just find it sort of funny to me. There are other black characters in Keeper, but most of them are minor characters that that only show up for a chapter per book. There aren't any characters that are described in the series as people of color other than Black or East Asian, although I might be forgetting some characters. The few Black characters that are in the series, for the most part, act like white people. They have straight hair, except Maruka, who wears her hair in dreadlocks. Many names are westernized, and they talk with the same accents as the white characters. Most of the above features of the Black characters were first mentioned in book 1 or 2, and there are some other questionable sentences in the book, like how the gnomes are introduced as brown-skinned creatures who cultivate plants as willful servants to the elves, or how that one time where it's mentioned that Counselor Omori's dark skin gives him an air of importance. Like, what the heck does that mean? It's shown early into the series that the elves don't have any sort of racism or sexism like there is in the human world, but that doesn't mean that they aren't racist in some form. Number 1, the elves cut off ties with the humans because they feared how dangerous the humans had become. The cause of this was that a member of the Neverseen had actually experimented on hundreds of humans a while ago, and the mistrust towards the elves from these disappearances caused the humans to become violent towards them as a whole. But most of the elves don't know this, and the government only learned this information in book 6 of the series, so they still view humans as inferior and that they don't need to be protected. Even if all the elves did find out that the humans cutting off was an elf's fault, it would be nearly impossible to change their racist ideals. Sophie has different ideas than this because she was raised by humans and cares about her family, which is implemented well enough into the books. Sophie's human family doesn't get any development apart from Amy's involvement in book 6. They're more of a jumping off point for Sophie's quote-unquote character development and the main plot. But it is interesting to see not only how Sophie views humans compared to the rest of the elves, but also how Amy feels about everything that Sophie's dealt with without her. Number 2. Additionally, there's another sort of racism that's set into elven culture even earlier in the series. This is set up very earlier in the first book, where Sophie's going around the lost cities with Fitz and Alden. She's already seen huge, sparkling cities, but when she comes to Mysterium to pick up some medicine from an apothecary, it's much more basic. Mysterium is a working class city, which you would think the elves wouldn't have since everyone has the same amount of money, or at least given the same amount of money at birth. Are the elves communists? What type of economy would that fall under? Mysterium is working class because it's where the talentless elves come to work. They can't be in the nobility because they're not special enough, so they end up working ordinary jobs away from the glitz and glamour of Eternalia and Atlantis because they're apparently not suited for noble jobs. Mysterium is described as being crowded and gloomier than the other lost cities. This racism ties into the prejudice against quote-unquote bad matches, which is number 3. The lost cities have a matchmaking system where you're given lists of up to 500 options for marriage. This prevents yucky stuff or an unhappy relationship, but talentless people are never matched with people with abilities. And if you marry someone that wasn't on your list, you're a bad match and you're shunned by society. It's only revealed that elves can get a divorce or a match fail in book 6 as well. This is just as socially accepted as a bad match is. Sophie hates these forms of racism because both of them have affected Dix as the child of a talentless and a person with an ability, and she's seen up close how they've affected Dix's views of himself and his family. I'm afraid all of these conflicts will be resolved with Sophie being the white savior. The white savior media trope is when a group in the minority is oppressed, but they are quote-unquote saved from oppression by someone who isn't in the oppressed group, usually someone in the majority group instead, like a white person for America. This trope poses a problem because the oppressed group is shown as not capable of liberating themselves and therefore still inferior to the oppressors. They needed the help of someone not in their community to win. It wasn't them who won, it was the savior winning for them. This doesn't prove the racist wrong, it proves the racist right. And there's nothing in Keeper that makes me think the humans or the talentless elves can fight for themselves. The 4th form of racism the series shows early on is the stigma against multiple births, because elven society values power so much, and they believe that multiple births are prone to being less powerful and genetically worse. Why? I don't know. This means that multiple births, like twins or triplets, are shunned by society, sometimes even covered up by their parents. Dex already had to deal with society looking down on him because his parents are a bad match, so imagine what he had to deal with when his triplet siblings were born. Tam and Lena are twins, and they have so much trauma from their parents, which the reader sits through a moderate amount of discussion about, and is good. It is good. It is very good. While I was writing the script for this video, Keeper's 9th book had its release date, name, and cover released. I'd had a sliver of hope that this book would focus less on Keef than the previous ones, but unfortunately the title is literally Deltarune. Its blurb has also been released, and it doesn't add much for the theorists. From a plot perspective, it looks like Sophie's going to be looking for answers and tying all the loose plot threads together, which will lead the series into the 10th and final installment. The cover of the book, thankfully, does not feature Keef, and instead features Maruka and a reddish-haired Marilla alongside Sophie. I'm not counting this as Keef's not going to show up much in this book, since it's not like Wiley or Tam were in much of flashback either. You know that his name is going to be constantly mentioned, and his disappearance going to be part of why Sophie's looking for so many answers. The first chapter was released at San Diego Comic-Con after writing the script. I was completely right. Shannon Messenger gave the website Nerdist a statement when the cover for Deltarune was released. In it, she says, "This is particularly exciting because there's such incredible girl power on display." I also vaguely remember that in her original Instagram post for the cover reveal, she said something about how she's wanted to have a girl power cover for a while now. I'll show the original text if I find it. To me, this is as close to confirmation as we'll ever get that there has been a lot of corporate interference with the Keeper books, possibly even changing the writing and design of the cover scene so that it would be more appealing to potential male buyers. I'm hoping that this also means that the publisher of the series shoehorned in the love triangle stuff and that it wasn't Shannon's fault. We'll probably never know, and if we do, it'll be a while after the final book is released. It's safe to say the Keeper series and its fandom is looking pretty uncertain right now. We hope that book 9 will be good, or at least better, but we can only hope. At least there have been some good signs. Shannon getting a year off, even if she didn't write for any of it, had to go a long way. The series is heading into its final chapters, which means that the plot's getting tied together and might be more consistent. Overall, you can probably tell from the 14,000 words I've written on this kids' book series what my answer is to the guiding question of this video. Keeper of the Cities doesn't have a set point where the series went bad. In fact, the books weren't great from the beginning. You can say the series started going wrong after your favorite installment, or after Neverseen because that's what I said was the best book in the series. I guess you'd be right about that. You could also say that Nightfall was longer than the previous books and written on the same time limit, meaning that it was rushed and therefore that's how the series got so bad. Or you could say it went downhill whenever the Deltarune plot started, which is probably also Nightfall. You get what I'm saying now. The fallen quality of the Keeper series is a convoluted arc with multiple factors going into it, just like the plot of the series itself. You can't read a book by its cover, and you can't read a series this complex without reading between the lines. That's all for this video. I hope it was long enough to suit your lengthy video essay desires. Go pre-order Deltarune. Bye.
Oh, right, I didn't record an outro. Okay. So this video took 10 months to do. It might seem like it was like really not much effort put into it, but it was took so long. I didn't know how to make a video. Thanks for watching to the end of the video. I didn't think anyone would do that, but you have surpassed my expectations, and I thank you for that. Please consider commenting, liking, subscribing if you want to get this video out to more people, because I really did put so much work into it, and yeah, thank you.